He thought he could humiliate her in front of everyone. But he had no idea he was about to lose something far more valuable than a single sale. The glass doors of the dealership slid open with a soft hiss as Emily Carter stepped inside, her worn sneakers barely making a sound against the polished marble floors that reflected rows of luxury cars worth more than most homes. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off chrome details and flawless paint, and for a brief moment, the entire showroom seemed to pause, as if deciding whether she belonged there. She didn't look like the usual clientele. No designer bag, no tailored suit, no air of urgency or entitlement. Just a simple woman in faded jeans and a plain white shirt, her hair tied back, her posture calm, her eyes quietly observant. At the far end of the showroom, Blake Thompson adjusted his navy tie, his gaze locking onto her with the precision of someone trained to judge within seconds. Years in luxury sales had taught him one thing: serious buyers announced themselves before they ever spoke. And this woman did not. He didn't walk over. Not yet. Instead, he turned his attention to a couple examining a six-figure SUV, his voice smooth, practiced, warm. But his eyes flicked back to Emily, again and again, measuring, dismissing. Emily moved slowly between the cars, her fingertips grazing the air just above the polished surfaces, careful not to leave a mark. She stopped in front of a midnight blue coupe displayed on a raised platform, its price tag discreet but unmistakable, $280,000. Her eyes lingered, not with longing, but with quiet certainty. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost blending into the low hum of the showroom. "Excuse me," she said, looking toward Blake. He didn't respond immediately. A deliberate pause. A subtle message. Only after finishing his sentence with the other clients did he turn, offering her a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, though the tone suggested otherwise. Emily nodded gently. "I'd like to know more about that coupe," she said, gesturing toward the car. For a split second, something flickered across Blake's face. Amusement, maybe disbelief. Then it hardened into something sharper. He let out a small, humorless chuckle, just loud enough to carry. Nearby conversation slowed. Heads turned. "That vehicle," he said, his voice rising slightly, "is for serious buyers." A few customers exchanged glances. Someone smirked. The air shifted. Emily didn't react. Her expression remained steady, her eyes level. "I understand," she replied calmly. Blake took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound polite, but not enough to hide the edge. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable looking at something in a different price range," he added, gesturing vaguely toward the exit. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch, suspended between judgment and something no one there could yet see coming. Blake let the silence stretch just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable, then crossed his arms as if the matter had already been settled. Emily stood there, still and composed, her gaze resting on the coupe as though his words had barely reached her. That, more than anything, irritated him. Most people in her position would have flushed, stammered, or quietly retreated. She did none of those things. Instead, she took a small step closer to the platform, her voice calm and even. "I would still like to see the interior," she said. The request hung in the air, simple and direct, yet it landed like a challenge. A faint murmur rippled through the nearby customers, curiosity beginning to replace amusement. Blake's jaw tightened slightly. He had seen this before, people pretending confidence, hoping persistence might compensate for what they lacked. He leaned in just enough to lower his voice, though not enough to keep others from hearing. "That model is shown by appointment only," he replied, his tone polished but firm. "Our serious clients understand that." The words were deliberate, each one placed carefully to draw a line she was not meant to cross. Emily nodded once, as if acknowledging a reasonable rule, but her eyes did not move from the car. "Then I would like to make an appointment," she said. A pause followed. Not the kind that invited consideration, but the kind that sharpened tension. Blake straightened, letting out a soft laugh that carried farther than he intended. "Appointments are typically arranged in advance," he said, this time loud enough for the entire showroom to hear. "With verification." A couple near the SUV exchanged knowing glances. Someone whispered. The atmosphere shifted again, no longer neutral, but leaning toward spectacle. Emily finally turned her head, meeting Blake's gaze directly. There was no anger there, no embarrassment, only a quiet steadiness that felt out of place in a room built on status and impression. "I am prepared to purchase today," she said. The statement was simple, but it landed heavier than expected. For a fraction of a second, Blake hesitated. Then his expression hardened, the brief uncertainty replaced by something colder. "A cash purchase?" he asked, the edge in his voice unmistakable. A few soft chuckles followed, quick and dismissive. Emily did not respond immediately. The silence stretched, thick and deliberate. "Yes," she said at last. That was when Blake's composure shifted completely. He stepped back slightly, as if creating distance between reality and what he believed was happening. "This is not a place for games," he said, his voice sharper now. "We deal with clients who understand the level of investment involved." He gestured toward the car, then back at her, the contrast unspoken but painfully clear. "People who can afford vehicles like this do not walk in looking like." He stopped himself, but the meaning had already landed. The room had gone completely quiet. Every eye was on them now. Even the sales staff who had tried to remain discreet were watching openly. Emily's hands remained at her sides, relaxed, unmoving. She took a slow breath, her posture unchanged. Then, without raising her voice, she asked one final question. "So you are refusing to sell to me?" Blake did not hesitate this time. "I am suggesting," he said, each word measured, "that you find somewhere more appropriate." The sentence echoed across the marble floors, settling into the space like a verdict. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the entire showroom was waiting to see what she would do next. For a brief second, it looked like she might argue, might defend herself, might try to prove something to a room that had already made up its mind. But Emily Carter did none of that. She simply held Blake's gaze, her expression unreadable, as if she had just been given information rather than insulted. Then, slowly, she gave a small nod. "I see," she said, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry across the showroom. There was no tremor in it, no hesitation, just acceptance. And that, more than anything, unsettled the people watching. Blake shifted his weight, expecting resistance, maybe even embarrassment. Instead, he found himself standing in front of someone who seemed entirely unaffected by his words. It was as if the judgment hanging in the air had nowhere to land. Emily glanced once more at the midnight blue coupe, her eyes tracing its lines with the same calm attention she had shown from the beginning. For a moment, it almost felt like she was memorizing it. Then she turned back to Blake. "Thank you for your time," she said. Polite, measured, final. A few customers exchanged glances, their earlier amusement fading into something quieter, less certain. The laughter had stopped. In its place was a strange tension, the kind that builds when a moment does not resolve the way people expect it to. Emily took a step back, then another, her movements unhurried, controlled. Her sneakers made soft, almost inaudible sounds against the marble floor, each step echoing just enough to be noticed in the sudden silence. Blake watched her, a faint frown forming as something unfamiliar crept into his thoughts. This was not how these situations usually ended. There was no apology, no retreat driven by embarrassment, no attempt to save face. Just departure. As she reached the glass doors, Emily paused. Not dramatically, not to draw attention, but just long enough to turn slightly over her shoulder. Her eyes met Blake's one last time. And in that brief moment, there was something different there. Not anger, not hurt, something steadier, something that did not need validation from anyone in that room. "I will come back tomorrow," she said. The words were simple, almost soft, but they carried with them a weight that lingered long after she turned away. The doors slid open again with that same quiet hiss, and then she was gone, swallowed by the bright afternoon light outside. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The room held its breath. Then, slowly, the noise returned. Conversations resumed, though not with the same confidence as before. A customer cleared his throat. Another glanced toward the entrance, as if expecting something more to happen. Blake let out a short exhale, straightening his tie, brushing off the moment with a dismissive scoff. "People like that," he muttered under his breath, though it was loud enough for a few nearby ears to catch. "They always say they will come back." A couple of employees nodded, eager to align themselves with his certainty. The rhythm of the showroom began to reset. Orders were discussed. Deals were negotiated. Laughter returned, thinner this time, less genuine. But beneath it all, something had shifted. Unseen, unspoken, and somewhere in the back of Blake's mind, a quiet, persistent thought began to form, one he quickly pushed aside without understanding why. Because what he did not realize, what no one in that room could possibly know, was that tomorrow was not a promise. It was a warning. The next morning arrived quietly, as if the world itself had decided to move on without remembering what had happened the day before. Sunlight stretched across the dealership's glass facade, reflecting rows of polished vehicles that stood untouched, waiting for the right kind of customer. Inside, everything looked the same. The marble floors gleamed. The scent of leather and polish lingered in the air. Salesmen adjusted their ties, rehearsed their smiles, and prepared for another day of high-value transactions. Blake Thompson stood near his usual spot, reviewing numbers on his tablet, his confidence fully restored. Yesterday had already begun to fade in his mind, reduced to just another insignificant encounter. He had seen hundreds of people walk in with curiosity and walk out with nothing. There was no reason to think this time would be any different. A couple entered, dressed sharply, and Blake immediately stepped forward, his demeanor shifting into that practiced charm that had earned him top commissions. His voice was smooth, his posture open, his attention fully engaged. This was his world. This was where he thrived. And then, outside, something changed. At first, it was just a sound. Low, smooth, almost too refined to be noticed. A few heads turned instinctively toward the glass entrance as a long, black vehicle glided into view. It did not rush. It did not demand attention. It simply arrived. The sunlight caught its surface, revealing a finish so immaculate it seemed almost unreal. Conversation slowed. A salesman near the entrance paused mid-sentence. Someone whispered, barely audible, "Is that a phantom?" The name hung in the air like a quiet confirmation of something important. The car came to a stop directly in front of the dealership. For a moment, nothing happened. The engine idled softly, steady and controlled, as if even the machine understood the weight of the moment. Inside, Blake glanced up, his eyes narrowing. Slightly. He had seen expensive cars before. That was, after all, his business. But this was different. There was a presence to it, a kind of quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. The front door opened, and a man stepped out. His suit was tailored to perfection, dark and understated, every detail precise without being excessive. He moved with calm confidence, the kind that came not from trying to impress, but from never needing to. The air in the showroom shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Staff straightened. Conversations softened. The man walked toward the entrance with measured steps, his expression composed, his eyes focused. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. He knew exactly where he was going. Blake felt something tighten in his chest, though he could not yet explain why. It was not recognition. Not yet. But something about the man's presence disrupted the comfortable rhythm he had rebuilt since yesterday. The glass door slid open, and the man stepped inside. For a brief moment, the entire showroom seemed to hold its breath. And then, as his gaze swept across the room, it landed on a space that had been empty just seconds ago. A space where, without anyone noticing when she arrived, Emily Carter now stood once again, calm, composed, exactly where she had been the day before. And suddenly, the promise she made did not feel like a simple return. It felt like the beginning of something Blake was no longer in control of. For a moment, no one moved. The air inside the showroom felt different now, heavier, as if something invisible had shifted the balance of the room. Emily Carter stood exactly where she had been the day before, her posture calm, her expression unchanged, as though time had not touched her at all. But everything around her had. The man who had stepped out of the Rolls-Royce Phantom walked forward with quiet precision, his shoes making soft, deliberate sounds against the marble floor. Every step drew attention without demanding it. Conversations faded completely. Even the background music seemed distant. Blake Thompson felt it then, that subtle tightening in his chest growing sharper. His instincts, the same ones he trusted to close million-dollar deals, were telling him something was wrong. Very wrong. The man's gaze did not wander. It did not scan the showroom the way a potential buyer might. It moved with intention, locking onto Emily as if the rest of the world simply did not exist. And when he reached her, the shift became undeniable. "Emily," he said, his voice calm, controlled, yet carrying effortlessly across the silent room. There was no question in it, no uncertainty, only recognition. Emily turned slightly toward him, her expression softening just enough to acknowledge his presence. "Good morning," she replied, her tone steady, familiar. Not impressed, not surprised. Familiar. That single detail landed harder than anything else. A ripple moved through the staff. A salesman near the entrance straightened abruptly. Another glanced toward Blake, confusion flickering across his face. Because this was no longer a random interaction. This was connection. Real, undeniable connection. Blake stepped forward instinctively, his polished confidence returning out of habit rather than certainty. "Good morning, sir," he said, forcing a professional smile into place. "Welcome to our dealership." The man turned his head slightly, acknowledging Blake with a brief glance that was neither dismissive nor welcoming. It was something else entirely. Measured. Evaluating. "I believe my wife was here yesterday," he said. The words landed like a quiet thunderclap. Wife. The room froze. Every conversation that had begun to recover fell silent again. Blake's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, before he quickly corrected it. "Your wife?" he repeated, though he already knew the answer. The man's gaze shifted back to Emily, then returned to Blake. "Emily Carter," he said simply. There was no need to explain further. The realization spread through the room like a slow wave. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Someone near the back whispered something under their breath. Blake felt the ground beneath his confidence begin to shift. He searched his memory, replaying every word from yesterday, every look, every decision. The polished surface he relied on was cracking, piece by piece. "I see," Blake said, though his voice no longer carried the same certainty. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding. The man did not respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, the same way Blake had done the day before, but this time it felt entirely different. Controlled. Intentional. "Was there?" he asked quietly. The question was simple, but it held weight. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just precise. The kind of question that did not need repetition. Blake opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time in a long time, the words did not come easily. And as he stood there, under the calm, unwavering gaze of the man in front of him, he began to understand something he had completely missed the day before. This was not a second chance. This was the consequence. Blake's throat tightened as the silence stretched, the weight of that simple question pressing down on him in a way he had never experienced before. Just yesterday, he had controlled this room with ease, every word calculated, every gesture deliberate. Now, standing in front of Emily Carter and the man beside her, that control felt fragile, slipping through his fingers. "I believe there may have been a miscommunication," Blake said carefully, choosing each word as if it might determine the outcome of something far greater than a single sale. His tone was softer now, stripped of the sharp edge it carried the day before. Around them, the showroom remained still. Staff members stood frozen in place, their attention fixed on the unfolding moment. No one interrupted. No one moved. It was as if the entire space had been reduced to this single exchange. The man regarded Blake quietly, his expression unreadable. There was no anger in his eyes, no visible frustration, only a calm presence that made the tension even more difficult to navigate. "A miscommunication," he repeated, not as a question, but as a statement being examined. Blake nodded slightly, forcing a polite smile. "If your wife was here yesterday, I assure you we value every customer who walks through our doors," he said. The words sounded correct, professional, practiced, but they did not land the way he intended, because everyone in that room had been there. Everyone had heard what was said. Emily remained silent, her gaze steady, offering no assistance, no correction. She did not need to. The truth did not require explanation. The man took a slow step forward, closing the distance just enough to shift the dynamic completely. "My wife asked to see a vehicle," he said. "She was refused." Each sentence was delivered with precision, not raised, not forced, but undeniable. Blake opened his mouth to respond, but again, the words did not come easily. "We have certain procedures," he began, his voice faltering for the briefest moment. "High-value inventory requires respect, The man interrupted gently. Not loudly, not aggressively, but the single word cut through. The explanation before it could form. The room went silent again, deeper this time. Even the faint sounds from outside seemed to disappear. Blake's composure cracked just enough to be seen. He adjusted his tie, a small gesture that no longer carried the confidence it once did. Of course, he said quickly. Respect is very important to us. The man held his gaze for a moment longer, then let the silence settle. It was not rushed. It was not uncomfortable for him. Only for Blake. Then perhaps you can explain, he continued, why my wife was told she did not belong here. The words echoed softly, but their impact was immediate. A few employees shifted uncomfortably. One of them looked down, unable to meet the scene unfolding in front of them. Blake felt the weight of every eye in the room, every unspoken acknowledgement of what had happened the day before. His carefully constructed authority was unraveling, not through confrontation, but through exposure. That was not our intention, he said, though the sentence lacked the certainty it needed. Emily's expression did not change. She simply stood there, calm, composed, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. And in that stillness, Blake began to understand something he had never considered before. This was not about a car. It was not about a sale. It was about something far more difficult to recover once lost. And as the silence returned once more, heavier than before, it became clear that no explanation he could offer would be enough to restore what had already been broken. Blake stood there, the silence pressing in from all sides, no longer something he could control, but something he was trapped inside. For the first time in years, he felt exposed, not by accusation, but by the simple presence of truth that no longer needed to be spoken. He straightened slightly, forcing his posture back into something resembling authority, though it no longer carried the same weight. If there was any misunderstanding, he began again, his voice carefully measured, we would be more than happy to make things right. The offer hung in the air, polished, professional, and hollow. Because everyone in the room knew this was not about correcting a mistake. It was about recovering from one that had already revealed too much. The man beside Emily studied him for a moment, his expression unchanged, as if he were considering not the words themselves, but the intention behind them. Then, slowly, he glanced around the showroom. His gaze moved across the staff, the customers, the polished cars, the carefully constructed environment designed to signal exclusivity and status. And then it returned to Blake. Make things right, he repeated quietly. There was no mockery in his tone, only a calm reflection that made the phrase sound smaller than it had moments before. Emily remained still, her presence steady, unshaken by the shift in tone or power. She did not step forward. She did not intervene. She allowed the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to. The man took a small step closer, not enough to intimidate, but enough to redefine the space between them. Yesterday, he said, my wife walked in here and asked to be treated like a customer. Each word was clear, deliberate. She was not asking for special treatment. The room was completely silent now. No movement, no distraction, just the weight of his voice filling the space. Blake felt it in his chest, a tightening he could no longer ignore. She was told she did not belong, the man continued, in front of everyone. A faint shift moved through the onlookers, subtle but undeniable. A shared awareness. Blake's lips parted slightly, but no immediate response followed. Because there was nothing he could say that would change what had already been witnessed. The man let the silence settle again, not rushing it, allowing it to do the work words no longer could. Then he spoke once more. So tell me, he said, his voice steady. What exactly are you trying to make right? The question landed with precision, not aggressive, not raised, but impossible to avoid. Blake felt his carefully constructed confidence collapse inward, replaced by something unfamiliar. Not fear. Not yet. But the recognition that he was no longer in control of how this would end. He glanced briefly at Emily, as if searching for something in her expression that might guide him, but she offered nothing. No anger. No satisfaction. Just quiet certainty. And in that moment, Blake realized something that unsettled him far more than any confrontation could have. This was not a negotiation. This was a reflection. And every word he chose now would not change the past, only reveal who he truly was in the present. The room remained silent, waiting, as the weight of that realization settled over him completely. Blake felt the question settle over him like weight he could not shift, the kind that did not demand an answer but exposed the absence of one. For years, he had built his reputation on control, on reading people in seconds, on deciding who mattered and who did not before they even spoke. And now, standing in the same showroom where that instinct had always worked in his favor, he realized it had failed him completely. He cleared his throat, the sound sharper than he intended in the quiet room. "We value every client," he said again, but the sentence no longer carried conviction. It sounded rehearsed, detached from the reality everyone had just witnessed. The man did not interrupt him this time. He simply listened, his expression calm, almost patient, as if giving Blake every opportunity to reveal himself fully. Emily stood beside him, her presence unchanged, her silence more powerful than any argument she could have made. She did not look at the staff. She did not look at the customers. Her attention remained steady, focused only on the moment as it unfolded. Blake glanced briefly around the showroom, as if searching for support, but found none. The employees who had once mirrored his confidence now avoided his eyes. The customers who had quietly agreed with his judgment now stood still, watching without expression. The room had shifted, and he was no longer at the center of its approval. The man took a slow breath, then spoke, his voice even, controlled. "You did not lose a sale yesterday," he said. The sentence hung in the air, simple but deliberate. Blake felt something tighten again, a quiet warning he could not ignore. The man continued, not raising his voice, not changing his tone. "You made a decision." Each word landed with clarity. Not loud, not forced, just undeniable. Blake swallowed, the movement visible now, his composure no longer seamless. "And today," the man added, "you are asking for a different outcome." He paused, letting the silence settle one last time, the kind of silence that did not invite interruption but demanded understanding. Then he looked directly at Blake, his gaze steady, unwavering. "But respect is not something you offer after the fact," he said. "It is something you show from the beginning." The room went completely still. No one shifted. No one spoke. Even the faint hum of the dealership seemed to disappear under the weight of that statement. Blake stood there, the realization finally settling in fully, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, unavoidable truth. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to repair, because what had been lost was not a transaction, but something far more fundamental. The man turned slightly, his posture relaxed, as if the matter had already been concluded. Emily followed his movement without hesitation, her steps quiet, her expression unchanged. She did not look back. She did not acknowledge the room that had once judged her. She simply walked forward, leaving the space exactly as she had found it, but not the same. And as the glass doors opened once again, letting in the bright morning light, Blake remained where he stood, the echo of his own decisions surrounding him, the silence now belonging entirely to him. The doors closed behind them with a soft, final sound, and for a moment, no one inside the showroom seemed to breathe. The light shifted slightly as the Rolls-Royce Phantom remained parked outside, its presence no longer just impressive, but symbolic. Inside, Blake Thompson stood exactly where he had been left, his reflection faintly visible in the polished marble beneath him, though it no longer looked the same. Around him, the dealership slowly came back to life, but not in the way it had before. Conversations resumed in fragments, quieter now, uncertain. A customer who had been waiting for assistance glanced toward another salesperson instead of Blake. One of his colleagues stepped forward to take over a conversation he would normally lead. No one said anything directly, but the shift was unmistakable. The authority he had relied on had not been taken from him. It had simply dissolved. Blake adjusted his tie again, a habit that no longer brought comfort, only awareness. His mind replayed the moment over and over, not the arrival of the car, not the man's presence, but the exact second Emily had stood in front of him the day before, calm, composed, asking nothing more than to be treated with basic respect. He had seen her, he had judged her, and he had been wrong. The realization did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like a truth that could no longer be avoided. Across the showroom, one of the junior sales associates approached the entrance, glancing outside at the car still waiting. There was a hesitation in his movement, a recognition that something important had just passed through their doors and left without looking back. The phantom did not rush as it pulled away. It moved with the same quiet confidence it had arrived with, disappearing into the flow of traffic as if it had never needed to prove anything at all. Inside, the space it left behind felt larger, emptier in a way that had nothing to do with square footage. Blake finally lowered his hand from his tie, letting it rest at his side. He looked around the showroom, really looked this time, not at the cars or the numbers or the potential commissions, but at the people, at the way they moved, at the way they were watching him now, not with admiration, but with something closer to understanding. And in that moment, he understood something too. Respect was never about who walked through the door. It was about how you chose to see them when they did. The marble floors still reflected the same light. The cars still gleamed under the same ceiling. The dealership had not changed, but something inside it had. And as Blake stood there, surrounded by everything that once defined his success, he realized that the most important thing he had lost was not a client, not a sale, not even a reputation. It was the simple ability to recognize value before it needed to be proven. And that day, without a single raised voice, without a single threat, the room had remembered what dignity looked like.